on our way to the panel. Come along, see what we can see.
What is the fascination of drawing military and war comics? Is there a fascination with it?
What a lot of people don't know is that almost every single comic book character in history has its roots in the military of some kind. Stan Lee was actually a sergeant in the United States Army during World War II, and that's where he came up with a lot of the characters that we know now. So if you look at everybody from Captain America all the way down to Spider-Man, if you actually trace their lineage all the way back to their origins, they were all actually somehow connected with the military. I mean, the Hulk was a gamma bomb experiment put forward by the United States Army. The spider that actually bit Spider-Man originally was a government research project into the theories of radioactivity. You know, so that's kind of been ingrained in comics from the beginning. For me, just like he was saying, is that it really is a human story, and you talk about the band of brothers and where people actually have to overcome the diversity of not just training and growth and becoming something better or more important than they are originally, but it's all about brotherhood and humanity, and it actually binds people together in a way that no other type of situation really can. And that, taken into a science fiction realm or even into a Western or any other kind of genre, is where you actually build the best kinds of characters, in my opinion.
So how does this influence your work when you write stories and draw characters?
I pull a lot of personal background out of my time as a Marine into some of the characterizations. What's interesting about the military is that you see in movies that these guys are funny and goofy and drunk and stupid and crack jokes, and the truth is it couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, when it comes to their jobs and everything that they do, they're very locked on, they're laser guided, and they're very, very good at what they do, because they know that if they screw up, then the guy next to them is going to die. And the whole reason that we do what we do is for each other when it comes to a military setting. So if you can pull the best of the best out of the people that you know and utilize that into your writing, we all write, as writers, we write what we know. And that's why people make the best stories that they can. So that's where that comes from for me. The America's Army project that I worked on actually started as an educational and entertainment outreach program that the Army made to really try to tell people that, look, we're not all gun-toting idiots that just want to go around and shoot people. In the Army, they had over 250 different jobs that you could choose from, you know, from veterinarian to supply clerk and cook and all sorts of really technological things like UAV technicians and flying drones and all sorts of different things. So they really wanted to use the comic book as an opportunity to educate people about what the military was besides just that. A subtext side of that, as what I call the bad American side of me, is that I tell the story of the hypocrisy. A lot of guys that go into combat, they don't actually know why they're there. They're just being told, hey, you know what? You're an instrument of policy. You don't make policy. You just go and do it. So whether they tell them to go take a hill for whatever reason, it doesn't even matter. They just have to go do it. At the time that I started crafting the America's Army story, Putin hadn't gone into Georgia yet. So I actually saw that coming on the horizon. A lot of us had talked about it in a circle, a writer's circle, and said, hey, if the world was going to fall apart, how would we do it? Well, it would start with Putin doing this and going into there. And I said, hey, that's actually a really great story. So that's what happens in the America's Army comic, is that there's a fictitious country called Servania that actually invades a neighbor and tries to take it for its own. The Army's brought in for a humanitarian mission. They actually attack the Army, and then it becomes a full-blown war. What I tried to do in that story is I tried to actually take a look at the political landscape of the world at the time and say, we didn't care about this country because they had nothing to offer America, so we didn't want to go in and help them until the UN actually stepped in and said, we need to do this. It was really important to me to show that it wasn't just this jingoistic, rah-rah, like we're going to take guns and explosions and blow stuff up and show you how awesome the military is, because sometimes it's really not. Sometimes you have to do things that you don't want to do, and you know, you hope in the long term, in the big picture, that actually ends up being the right way to do it. But there is a hypocrisy for me as a writer, because here I am and I promote violence. You know, I'm shooting people and blowing shit up and killing things, but I don't really believe in that. But it sells well, and that's what people want to read. So, you know, if you think about it, if Iron Man hit Captain America in the face, game over. That's the end of the fight. Cap loses. Sorry, I don't care what kind of super soldier serum you got. If Tony Stark hits Cap in the face, that's the end of the show right there. So, but I think that violence in comics is so overblown and so over the top that it's just super extraordinary, and it's completely unrealistic. And that adds to the entertainment factor. I mean, that sequence in Civil War when Cap and Bucky are fighting Iron Man and they're throwing the shield back and forth to each other, and he's zapping him and smacking him and hitting him and whacking it. It's like, wow, that's awesome! And I know that could never actually happen, so I don't look at that and think, yeah, wow, that's uber violent. I wouldn't let my kids look at that. That's insane. Like, no, obviously, there's no such thing as repulsor technology and shields and all that stuff. So, you know, that's a whole different level. You know, when you talk about, you know, kind of the baseline level, it's like I don't like to watch the news either. It actually makes me very depressed. You know, it's a very saddening thing. So, like you're saying, violence actually has to advance the narrative in some way, or it's just gratuitous for no reason.
Violence is incorporated in the stories without a deeper meaning, using it for the story.
Right.
It's very monotonous and boring.
I wrote a book called SOCOM SEAL Team 7, and it's about the U.S. Navy SEALs versus the underwater kingdom of Atlantis. So what happens is that there's a huge naval battle and 4 oil tankers are destroyed, and all that oil goes into the Gulf Stream and threatens the underwater kingdom. And so the Atlanteans go, enough, done. And they come to the surface to subjugate all of humanity. And so the militaries of the world have to unite to push them back. But what we come to find out, I'm going to spoil the ending, but please buy it anyway. The conspiracy of the story is the President of the United States knew that the Atlanteans would attack, because NATO is actually not what it seemed to be. This all happened before, back in World War II, and was a top secret operation. And so for the past 60 plus years, the president and the scientists of the world have actually been developing a chemical that can actually freeze salt water instantaneously and kill all the Atlanteans within the push of a button. So what the president wants to do is he wants to force a war to have the Atlanteans come up so he can then take over the planet and form the United Earth of America, right? See, there's me being a bad American again. My president's the bad guy in the entire story. So there's violence in it, but the violence actually comes from misunderstanding and miscommunication. So once that communication happens, once people are actually able to get into a room and argue it out and talk to each other, the violence stops. And when I'm not writing comics, I'm actually a graphic artist and a visual information specialist at a place in Garmisch-Partenkirchen called the Marshall Center. And there we actually do exactly that, as we are a German-American partnership to teach nations how to communicate with one another before they go to war with one another. So we have all these classes and seminars, and it's about trying to stop the violence before it even starts.
When you came from America and you're living here in Germany now, did this shift your view on what's happening with American foreign politics too?
Sure. In the public school system in America, we aren't taught a whole lot about the history of the majority of the world. But somebody asked me, they're like, hey, do you speak German? I'm like, yeah, I watched Raiders of the Lost Ark. I know how to say something, But it really has shifted. And when I first came here, I wasn't sure what to expect, because as an American, the only history we really have are movies and what we learned about World War II. But coming here, it's an amazingly beautiful country, and everybody's been extraordinarily welcoming and friendly, and I've made some fantastic friends and know some amazing people. And you look at the conflicts that have happened in Europe, and you think about the motivations behind it as compared to what you're taught as an American in the States and spoon-fed with media and news and social interaction, and it's quite different.
The work you did with IDW, I guess, is more realistic.
Yeah, that was actually the most realistic comic we ever did, because the United States Army was actually involved in the process. So they hired me to write the video game originally, because America's Army is a free-to-play first-person shooter that you can download on Steam. I wrote the game, and then they said, well, we really want to promote the the game more, how would we do that? And they came up with the idea of doing a comic book. IDW got involved a little bit later. We worked with senior military advisors. I had a panel of like 5 or 6 guys that would go through my scripts and go, no, 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 yes, no, no, you know. And I felt really badly for the artists because they had 3 technical advisors go through the art and go, no, 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 that's not what that tank looks like. It has 7 rivets, not 9. And then he'd have to redraw everything. So they were very meticulous in how the Army was portrayed and that everything was technically accurate. And it was tedious, but the book actually ended up being a really great book because once the Army kind of saw that we as a creative team, as the IDW editors and I was also the editor on the book, but with the scripts and with the art, we knew what we were doing and we were actually going to showcase the Army in a very positive light. Got out of the way, they let us work. And the book actually, after like issue 4, really starts an upward swing and starts to take off and becomes very exciting, and it's actually a lot of fun. Some of the best science fiction ever created actually mirrors the politics of the time. If you take a look back at the original Star Trek TV show, there was an episode called The Omega Glory. Yeah, I remembered that. And it's Kirk and Spock McCoy find another Federation starship in orbit around this planet, and everyone on board is dead. And there's only one guy that's remaining, and that's Captain Tracy, and he's gone down to the planet. And there are 2 warring factions on the planet, the Kongs and the Yangs. And it is the only TV show at the time that was ever allowed to reference the Vietnam War at all. Every censor blocked every story that they ever tried to do. Even MASH, that came a little later, tried to do an allegory of Vietnam using Korea. No, absolutely not. But Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek, all of the really great science fiction of the time have been able to kind of showcase what's going on in today's world and then utilize that in a science fiction setting to kind of put a different spin on it to show, you know, like in the Star Trek episode, you know, they actually kind of cheese it up and have the, you know, Declaration of Independence. And Kirk's like, we, the people of the United States of America, these have to go to the Kongs and the Yangs, well, it means nothing, you know, so it's like he's you know, preaching at some point. But what it does do is it allows you to touch upon themes that people can right now immediately identify with, and it doesn't take the science fiction part of it and take it too far out into somewhere else so people can't relate to it. And really good science fiction does that. As for weapons and gear and tech and all that stuff, I mean, you just have to look at something like Aliens and even Star Wars. One of the reasons that cosplay is so cool is that when the internet showed up, yes, I'm old, I'm pre-internet, we could actually figure out what everything was made out of. We all joined the communities and it's like, that's a Sterling submachine gun. That's what that Stormtrooper blaster is. And that's a Hensling counter that goes on the side, and those are those Greeblies, and this is what this is. I also have the benefit, I don't know if you guys know, I used to work at Industrial Light and Magic as a special effects artist, and I worked on the first 6 movies. I'm not that old, I worked on the special editions. So, but it was actually really cool that you could find out what all this stuff was. So now you could actually make a lightsaber out of a Graflex lightsaber or a flash gun handle and know what the T molding was and what the D ring was and put all this stuff together. And it was really cool. To your point, the technology is old 40s technology that they just added stuff to make it look really cool and hip. So you think about even with Rogue One that's coming out, they actually had to go back to the way of doing that because it was supposed to fit in between, you know, everything that had happened before Star Wars. So the inspiration comes from technology that we already have, and then you think, oh, it's got to be able to have a cyclic rate of like 7 times M240. It's like, okay, well, how would you do that? It's like, well, this has to be bigger, that has to be that. And you work really closely with your designer or your illustrator to make sure that stuff looks really cool, too. So on SEAL Team 7, I actually had the benefit of working with a guy named Alex Yeager, who is an Academy Award-nominated production designer who worked on Transformers. And he worked on the new Episode 7, but before that, he and I knew each other. We worked on like Wild Wild West and, you know, other movies from ILM. And he actually sat with me and we designed all of the Atlanteans, all of their gear. Atlanteans that lived underwater, if they wanted to come to the surface, they'd have to wear some sort of pressure armor that was filled with seawater or else they would die. So Alex designed all that, and we worked very closely together just to say, okay, I want it to look like this, I want to be able to see them through the face shield, I want to see water in there with a ripple effect. So it's constant communication, because art is a collaborative effort. Yes, the writer sits down and he sits with his computer, and I will tell you right now, as a writer, the scariest thing that you have is a blank screen. It's like, okay, how do I start? There was no such thing as a special effects company when George Lucas needed to make Star Wars. So what he did is he hired all the greatest cameramen that he could find and said, okay, here's $1 million, I need these special effects done, do it. And then he came back 6 months later and they said, okay, where are all my shots? John Dykstra stood there and said, we created a camera for $1 million. It's a motion control camera, and you can plug it into this computer and it'll do all these different things every single time exactly the same way. And George is like, what? Where are my X-Wings? Where's my Millennium Falcon? Where's the Rebel Blockade Runner? What are you doing? And he said, yeah, but we created this really cool camera. You know, so, but what they did do at that point is they created the art of motion control, which allowed them to move a camera. Because it used to be, before computers, that we actually shot miniatures on a blue screen, they sat on a post, and you couldn't move the miniature because it would wobble. So they would actually move the camera towards the miniature. And when you did that by hand, it would be in a different position each time. So it was very difficult to create a composite, because you'd have to take 3 different kinds of film, shot in 3 different ways, and splice them together to create a composite of a spaceship on screen. So if you think about the old movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Planet of the Apes, the camera never moves when you see the spaceships. The spaceships may be moving, but the camera doesn't move. Star Wars revolutionized that. So what John Dykstra actually did was revolutionize the art of filmmaking from the very beginning by creating a computer-controlled camera where he could go click, and it would do this move, this very fancy move for the X-Wings. And then they'd set up a matte pass where they had to do the blue screen shoot. They'd bring the camera back to 0 and he'd go click, and it would do the same exact thing every single time. And so at that point, once they got the models made, they were able to shoot every single miniature in that movie in like 3 months, where it usually takes a year. So anyway, sorry.
Okay, so
Anyway, James Cameron worked on Digital Domain and with Stan Winston.
thanks a lot.
Yeah, sorry. I'm a huge Philip K. Dick fan, and if you come by the booth, my recent comic is actually called Sentient, and it's about an advertising executive who doesn't know that he's actually a robot assassin that was built by the CIA. And so it's all about who are we? It's about the core of the comic is about humanity. It's, are we human because of the flesh and blood that we traverse the planet in? Can that robot be human? So, but at the core of it, hence the panel, he is an assassin for the CIA. So he does work for the United States government, but not really because he wants to. It's actually, you have to read it.
current work is taking a shift more to the cyberpunk themes.
Yeah, I like.
You're developing more into that area.
I like fiction, especially science fiction, that makes you think. And as much as I like to blow things up and shoot things, I like the reader to actually have something to read that they can actually think about and, you know, kind of make their own determinations based on what they read. So I think with what Star Wars did is that it showed us that you could call a spaceship a piece of junk and see that the universe was used. What Aliens did is it showed us that people were individuals, even in very unique and horrible situations. But inspirationally, what Aliens did for production design was more important really than it did for writers, because I remember we were working on a project called Shrapnel, which is essentially Joan of Arc in space. And the editor that I was working with, he told the illustrator, he said, no rivets, no metal doors, no grates, no, and we just started laughing, and he goes, I'm tired of seeing aliens all the time when I look at outer space.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was nice having you both here. If you're interested, you can go over to the comic booth, you can meet Zach, you can meet Guariguata, have a talk with him, get a copy of Bison, get a copy of America's Army. Have your signatures, whatever. Feel free. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.